Hello and welcome to Building Africa's Prosperity. I'm Chris Bishop. Now this week, South Africa, as the current chair of the African Union, has been leading the charge for financial support in the economic crisis brought on by COVID-19. Now, looking beyond the pandemic and towards economic recovery, increased trade is essential. The African Continental Free Trade Area promises to open up intercontinental trade. Even before COVID-19 changed the game plan, Africa's infrastructure gap was a matter for concern. Let's have a look at the background to today's discussion.
Infrastructure development is a key driver for progress across the African continent, as well as a critical enabler for productivity and sustainable economic growth. It contributes significantly to human development, poverty reduction, and the attainment of the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs. Infrastructure development is also key in facilitating intracontinental trade, which in turn will benefit the economies of trading partners. Development and improvement in infrastructural elements that will encourage trade include efficient road and rail systems, upgraded border posts, energy, reliable communication systems, and both inland and coastal trading ports. Economic growth within South Africa, SADC countries, and other African trading partners is also dependent on development in infrastructure such as manufacturing, schools, hospitals, water and sanitation, transport, and housing. Investment in infrastructure accounts for over half the recent improvement in economic growth in Africa. But now with COVID-19, economies have been caught on the back foot. What can be done to fill the infrastructure gap and encourage trade on the continent?
Joining me now to talk about filling the infrastructure gap and encouraging trade is Lerato Mataboge, the Deputy Director General of the South African Department of Trade and Industry. So just to start off with, let's just talk about the enormity of this African Continental Free Trade Area. I mean, Tito Mboweni, the Finance Minister, described it as the biggest story of the century. Do you think that's what we're talking about here?
Thank you very much for having me, Chris. Absolutely. I think we are all excited and optimistic about the impact that the Continental Free Trade Area is going to have on the economic prosperity of the African continent going forward. But we're also mindful that this positive impact will take a lot of work. It will not just happen organically or automatically. We have to take decisive policy actions. We have to make sure that we put in the necessary tools that are going to make sure that CFTA works. And it's for that reason that at AU level, including ourselves as South Africa chairing the AU now through President Ramaphosa, we are very clear that for the CFTA to work, it has to be standing on three pillars. The market integration pillar, which is the tariffs that we've been talking about over time and getting rid of some of the tariffs to foster the trade. The second pillar that we're very clear about is infrastructure development. To say it does not make sense that we deal with issues of tariffs, yet we do not have the infrastructure that's going to enable goods to move between markets on the continent. The third pillar is also one of industrial development, manufacturing platforms and the like, because we are also saying we can negotiate tariffs all we like, we can have plans for developing infrastructure, but if we do not have the productive capacity on the African continent to make our own products that we can trade amongst ourselves, then the CFTA is not going to materialize, or we're not going to realize the prosperity we're looking for. So those three areas are critical to the work that we are doing around the CFTA. Even more important around that is the issue of inclusivity and inclusive growth. We cannot leave the youth behind. We cannot leave women-owned businesses behind. So it's quite a complex undertaking, but quite an exciting one.
And sure, but also just checking on the idea of the timetable. And we had the Secretary General, a fellow South African, on the show recently from Ethiopia, and he was talking about July for the starting. I don't know, with COVID-19, is that timetable still realistic?
The timetable is not realistic insofar as the official operationalization of the CFTA, but it does not mean that we stop the work. The Council of Ministers has recommended that we postpone the date, and I think that's work in progress that has been done through that platform. But what is important is even during COVID, we are working so energetically around issues of infrastructure development that are going to support the trading goods that are supposed to start in July. We're also working to make sure that we create necessary value chains within the continent and having those conversations and mobilizing resources around making sure that the CFTA will have the infrastructure pillar and the industrial development pillar that are going to support the tariff issues and the market integration that was meant to start in July.
And as you know, South Africa is the chair now of the African Union. What are the prospects of every single nation on this continent taking part, you think, willingly in the new free trade zone?
Interestingly, COVID has presented an opportunity that has actually encouraged many more countries to want to be a part. And the reason I'm saying that is that last week, the president, as the chair of the AU, through the AU Bureau, launched an Africa supplier platform. That Africa supplier platform is quite catalytic and is going to play an important role around the CFTA as well. So a lot of countries are now working together to make sure that their manufacturers, their suppliers are on that platform and we can begin to trade amongst ourselves, particularly related to COVID response requirements, PPE, testing kits and the like. For the first time, we are seeing even those countries that are reluctant to sign on to the CFTA, they're beginning to see the importance of working together and trading amongst ourselves and making sure that it's not a race to the bottom insofar as the exchange of goods related to COVID. So the next phase then post this will be to expand this platform so that we are able to trade with even more goods. The president, when he was launching this platform, indicated that it's going to be an Alibaba-esque platform for the African continent, which we think is quite revolutionary. It gives life and meat to the CFTA itself, that there's an actual concrete project and platform that private sector can utilize to then exchange goods between ourselves as African countries.
Now let's get down to the subject of infrastructure. I mean, many years before this plan was conceived, there was a huge infrastructure gap on the continent, running into hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, it seems to me the new free trade area is going to put even more strain, well, hopefully with more trade, on that infrastructure network. How is the continent going to tackle the job of building enough for people to do business with?
Interesting enough, Chris, over the years, and already by 2018, we had seen that there'd been an increase in commitments for funding infrastructure on the continent. So there's increased support from, of course, governments themselves, African governments themselves, multilateral donors, to want to address the infrastructure gap and put money there. 2018, before COVID happened, there was a commitment of $100 billion for that year alone to deal with the infrastructure gap on the African continent. Of course, COVID has thrown some kind of a spanner in the works, but that does not mean that those resources are just going to disappear. What that means is that we need to now start thinking about the nature of infrastructure that we want to support. Now that COVID has introduced new dynamics to infrastructure and other projects on the African continent. So what also we have noticed is that the infrastructure funding, majority of it comes from African governments, 70% of it from the statistics. The question then remains, going forward, how do we then bring private sector in much more closely, also to put money in, not just as service providers in the infrastructure build, but as partners, as co-financiers? Because as you mentioned, the gap is quite huge. 100 billion for 1 year is not enough. We actually need more than that over 20 years annually. So it's about mobilizing new sources of funding that are going to assist us then to really decisively deal with the infrastructure gap that we have. But we have to also applaud the fact that there has been an upward swing, an upswing in terms of commitments that have been made compared to previous years to deal with the infrastructure gap on the continent.
And how is that job going to be tackled, particularly South Africa as chair of the African Union? It's obviously a lot of agencies have talked about this blending of private and public finance, but it's going to be a very hard sell, surely, at a time when the world and its finances are bleeding.
Absolutely. We are mindful that we have reached challenging times, but we believe that all of us have to roll up our sleeves. We all are beneficiaries of efficient infrastructure. As a society as a whole, private sector, government, if you will, and institutions. So it's about understanding that infrastructure development is the backbone to economic growth. So whether we are government or we private sector, it behooves us to work closely and mobilize the limited financing that we have to develop infrastructure. There's also been proposals around, for example, pension funds that could be utilized. There's been proposals around diaspora remittances, which of course they'll also be under pressure, but it's about getting creative about pooling resources and understanding that infrastructure is going to act as a stimulus that is going to help us to navigate this COVID, post-COVID world or current COVID world. So we do need a stimulus, and infrastructure is it. So we believe that all stakeholders must have all hands on deck, private sector and government. Nobody's absolved from the responsibility, but it's about us enabling one another. Government playing an enabling role, mobilizing funds where it can, and private sector also really stepping up much more strongly than in the past.
But it's still going to be a hard sell, you must accept that, because I mean, I've written more stories in the last 20 odd years about infrastructure projects on this continent than I can remember, and certain recurring themes came up. Often they overran, often there was a dispute between the government and the private partner about who should be getting what. Costs increase greatly, there can be disputes between contractors. It's not an easy sell for you, is it?
It's definitely not an easy sell, but you know, some of the areas we've been looking at is much smaller catalytic infrastructure projects. I think for the longest time there's been a lot of focus on your big bang, your huge mega projects that take decades to complete, and everybody gets sort of stuck in those big mega projects. They're important, yes. But there are also smaller catalytic projects that we need to look into, be it in the energy space, be it in the water and sanitation space, you know, be it also road connectivity that we could do in a short space of time, working private sector, short, efficient, affordable infrastructure projects that we can then begin to identify. So a number of regional communities are beginning to look at that, including SADC, where we belong to SADC. We're looking at now not just big bang projects, as I said, we're looking at small catalytic projects that can bring in societies as well.
Can you give me a couple of examples there? Can you give me a couple of examples there in bricks and mortar, exactly what you're talking about with these smaller projects?
Absolutely. One example I would give is the North-South Corridor. It's a large project. However, we've broken it into very bite-sized chunks. We funded a number of roads, for example, the Chirundu Road in Zimbabwe. And then we're looking at hydropower electric generation projects as well in the region, including in Zambia. So we're taking piecemeal small projects that collectively are going to stimulate the industrialization of the continent and the region. So it's about looking at that instead of finding, I don't want to give an example of Inga, but I will have to give that example. Finding a project as large as that then takes a long time to get delivered because of the sheer size of the project and the multiplicity of actors that you have to balance and manage. It's a critical project, but there are also smaller catalytic ones that collectively and jointly can begin to stimulate growth on the continent.
And again, you know, I mean, I think any infrastructure anywhere on this continent is great news. But sometimes I'm not sure. I'll just give you an example. I mean, the road between here and the port in Maputo, it's brilliant. I've driven it many, many times to Mozambique because people need to get their trucks there. They need to export. But unfortunately, if you want to go a bit north to one of the ports in Pemba or in Yamban right at the top, it's not so easy. I just sometimes feel that these limitations are still holding back business on the continent.
Absolutely, absolutely. Cross-border infrastructure is critical. And the reality is that the current infrastructure that we have on the continent is outward. We are still working on the basis of the colonial planning of the infrastructure, where a resource is taken out of the continent. Our links amongst ourselves that can foster intra-Africa trade, and whether it's road or rail, they're very, very, very limited and minimal. So the priority has to be cross-border infrastructure, where we can then have bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral agreements among countries to build the necessary infrastructure. It's time that our infrastructure approach is corridor-based, developmental corridor-based, and we make sure that there's a cross-border element to it. That way we can avoid a situation where efficient infrastructure stops at the border of one country, and the minute you cross the border, there's inefficiencies. The narrative has to be cross-border at all times on the continent, because that's where the deficiency is. The outward infrastructure that we have, from say a mining area straight to the port, the opportunities there insofar as maintenance and the like, but we need to create new infrastructure within the continent that connects countries, and quality, affordable, and efficient infrastructure at that. So that's a huge challenge that we all have to undertake as government and private sector.
But that's another issue, actually, which I think is quite interesting, because governments across the continent will also have to carry the cost of revamping border posts. I mean, I understand the border post at Bite Bridge to Zimbabwe is heading for a revamp. You tell me, you're more in the know on that one than I. But essentially, that's going to cost a fortune, because we're talking not only about trade, one day, one passport for everybody on the continent. Surely that's going to be a huge expense, and how are governments going to raise money for it?
Absolutely. To revamp infrastructure, to maintain infrastructure, or even to create new infrastructure costs a lot of money. But the economic benefit thereto outweighs the amount that can be spent. We do have Pan-African multilateral organizations and funders on the continent that are supportive of catalytic projects such as Bite Bridge, because it's understood that Bite Bridge literally allows us as South Africa to export to many, many countries beyond Zimbabwe. So it's quite an important border post. Organizations and funders like the AFDB, like the DBSA, are generally supportive of projects of that nature, that are that catalytic, that open up more avenues for economic growth. And all of us are working on the basis that we know that inefficient infrastructure costs this continent 40% in competitiveness. That's huge. So irrespective of the cost, we have a responsibility as far as possible to make commitments, particularly around those projects that can be catalytic and have a bigger impact, a bigger regional impact, and a bigger continental impact, such as the Bite Bridge border post.
And also, just talking about government coffers, I mean, you're more in the know than I am, being on the inside of government, but that you've got to accept that not only in this country, but across the continent, they're struggling at the moment simply because of COVID-19. So much money is having to be forked out in support for industry. In that context, how are we going to start up this infrastructure drive?
The president as the chair, and thankfully the envoys have done quite a bit of work. The president appointed envoys that are assisting with resource mobilization for the continent in response to COVID-19. And already what has happened, part of the work that the envoys have delivered is commitments for debt relief for a number of countries, so that they're able to then redirect resources to priority areas. COVID response. One of the proposals that is on the table is that a portion of the savings or the debt, the relief funds should be then dedicated to strategic and catalytic areas and projects. Infrastructure should be one of those. And it's important that we begin to encourage countries to commit part of their own, as limited as that money would be, part of their own GDP, part of their own funding that they get even from donors and the like, to infrastructure development. So that's the one part. The second part around response to COVID and the struggle is exactly this platform that I was talking about that was launched yesterday, an Africa supplier platform. Part of that platform also has enabled and empowered airlines on the continent to become cargo carriers of choice in response to COVID. That's quite big insofar as the support for the airline industry and infrastructure in that space. So we are quite encouraged that even in the midst of a crisis, there are opportunities that bring us closer together as a continent to collaborate much more strongly, to collaborate much more effectively, and to create platforms such as that, which we've never had before, to begin to crowd in African private sector players, African private sector players that can then begin to supply a number of requirements, COVID-related requirements, to the rest of the continent.
Now, you've mentioned one of the cornerstones of trade in the continent, cheap air travel. Another thing that has come out of this COVID-19, almost all of the airlines on the continent are struggling. And it seems that a lot of them are going to struggle to have a long-term future. Again, what can the African Union do about that?
We are mindful that the response to COVID entailed a number of measures that have slowed down economies. We needed to make sure that there's a risk-adjusted strategy, and a number of countries are pursuing this risk-adjusted strategy. We are very optimistic that in the coming months, the restrictions will be relaxed a little bit, because I think countries are now beginning to understand what needs to be done insofar as the response. So we all have to, for now, understand that it's important that we focus on livelihoods, we focus on lives rather, and make sure that we stabilize and we don't have a health crisis. We'll then look into issues of economic opening, including airlines. But the positive thing is that a number of the airlines are still very engaged and busy in the economic activity of moving cargo between countries. And that is very useful because it then ensures that trade continues to happen. It then ensures that those particular airlines continue to have some income stream in this crisis period.
And we've spoken a lot about the hurdles and challenges towards infrastructure with this continental free trade area, but let's just flip to the other side of the coin now. I think one thing that's getting lost in all of this debate about how it's going to happen is actually what promises to happen. How is it going to change the lives of business people and people in general on the continent when this free trade area finally does get going?
The CFTA is going to be revolutionary, provided we ensure that in tandem with what we've done to get rid of a number of barriers, tariff barriers to trade are sorted. We have to then make sure that we have a strong infrastructure build program on the continent. We have to make sure that as individual governments, we also begin to support decisively manufacturing on the continent and to create those value chains. It is through that then the jobs can be created. We can have more players and actors enter into the economy. The CFTA, just as an agreement that focuses on eliminating tariffs and goods, will not necessarily give us the results that we're looking for. It has to be supported by decisive programs around infrastructure and manufacturing and decisive intra-African investments as a key agenda item.
Just give us a couple of examples as well. Things that, I mean, for instance, what could I say? The internet, we could say, yes, has changed things for everybody, journalists and people in government alike. But can you give us a couple of examples what could really change the game for, like, small businesses, suppliers, the supply chain, once this thing gets going?
Oh, the CFTA is definitely going to affect the average person. Again, the two pillars that we are talking about, infrastructure development and manufacturing platforms, those are the vehicles where we're going to create the jobs that are needed. When we begin to decisively identify strategic corridors and strategic development projects on the continent in support of the CFTA, those projects will have to bring in private sector, small players, women-owned businesses, youth, and we have to be deliberate as governments. We have to be deliberate, even at the AU level, that localization, that transformation and empowerment are critical in all the projects that we undertake. Those conversations are very strong in the AU at the moment, so I'm quite confident that once we fully launch and we have completed all the negotiations, including the service negotiations, including dealing with the issues of infrastructure and manufacturing, and creating those platforms on the continent, we'll be able to articulate the opportunities that are going to come out of the CFTA much more decisively and much more clearly and in much more detail. So we have to make sure that all the infrastructure projects and all the manufacturing platforms that we're talking about are real and they are realized. We have started as South Africa with our master plans, for example. A number of other countries have launched their own industrial policies. The issue now is that how do we then begin to link those together and make sure that we benefit our respective societies?
Well, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating discussion there on the prospects and the problems and the challenges of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is going to change all our lives. Thank you very much indeed, Lerato Mataboge, the Deputy Director General of the South African Department of Trade and Industry. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this edition of Building Africa's Prosperity. From me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.